Aya nihkaninga nehe ewe malaka koke. Te pake ne olaka koke waha nungika kihkwe. Uni ne pe kishkake. Nila Myaamia mitosene waane. Me shikya wains waane. Takamwa penjewa pamanazwa ewe makeke. Nehe mangunzakwa lengwale sale. Jelawe makeke wayake cheke kihkayonge. Nehe Myaamia ewe makeke wayake cheke wapangya kamyonge. Nehe nujongi sipyonge. Me kim ane waha Myaamia mishine pandikane. Nungi kakihkwe atotamane keešiniihkihankwiki kati aancihtaakiaki. Hello to my friends and relatives. It's good to see you all here this day, this beautiful day. My name is George Ironstrack, and I'm a citizen of the Myaami tribe of Oklahoma. I descend from Takamwa, Pinjiwa, and Palanaswa. My Myaamia family can be found in Fort Wayne, in Miami and Lynn counties in Kansas, and Myaamia, Oklahoma, in the northeast corner of the state. I work here at Miami University in the Myaamia Center, and today I'm here to share with you my talk titled keešiniihkihankwiki kati aancihtaakiaki. We Will Raise the Changemakers. I want to start by recognizing that Daryl gave me full permission to run over my time, so I don't need to apologize. In the winter of 1824, a Myaamia leader, Myaamiaki, engaged an American visitor in a common pastime among grandparents everywhere, complaining about young people. Myaamiaki and Charles Trowbridge were discussing the development of Myaamia children into adults. Specifically, Myaamiaki complained at the young age at which people were getting married. In his generation, he said, men and women were considered unfit for marriage until the age of 23 or 25, and they never thought of breaking the law in this case. These days, he complained, the youth are becoming more and more foolish. They think themselves wise enough at 16 or 17 to do things which were formally prohibited. From Myaamiaki's point of view, in the Myaamia villages of the 1820s, unprepared children were assuming the roles of adults. On the one hand, some of Myaamiaki's complaining can be chalked up to his being a surly, argumentative, and somewhat downright crotchety old man. As some of you may know, he tried to stab one of our ancestors in a discussion they had one time. But on the other hand, some of his complaining was, at least in part, a result of his observations of disruptive changes sweeping through Myaamia society. Myaamiaki was witnessing a dramatic shift in the way that children became adults, and therefore a shift in the entire way his community functioned. Over the 80 years that followed these changes accelerated in many directions, and some became detrimental to the health of Myaamia people as a whole. There was a time when our village communities successfully raised generations of youth who were fully immersed in the traditions of their people. When these youth matured into adults, they were able to create change in their community, but change that drew upon the wellspring of generations of knowledge and experience. For change, on our own terms, has always been a vital part of our continuing existence. At a certain point, however, the balance of control shifted from majority internally driven changes to majority externally driven changes. Some of the most destructive externally driven changes we experienced were the fracturing of our homelands, beginning with the Treaty of Greenville, moving through the early 1800s, until the middle 1800s, when by the 1830s, only 500,000 acres remained roughly in collective hands. In addition, we experienced the division of our tribal populations through the fracturing of forced removals. with over 200 Myamis remaining in Indiana after the first forced removal in the fall of 1846. And as we learn more and more about the Kansas experience, many hundreds remaining behind in Kansas during the second forced removal to Indian Territory around 1873. And lastly, of the most dramatic disruptive experiences, our people experienced the boarding schools, as well as other forms of initially foreign schooling to us. You see Freeman Walker here, the boarding school from the Myaamia Reservation, where many, I'm sorry, not the boarding school, the schoolhouse from the Myaamia Reservation, where many of those from Myaamia's family and surrounding families attended school. And you see Jesse White here, the only Myaamia person in this photo, at Shawnee Mission School, a young man who was born in the East and then went west for boarding school experience. All of these factors led to the eventual dormancy of our language and the dormancy of much of our communal knowledge, including our understanding, our cultural understanding of child development. As we have reclaimed and revitalized our language, we have begun to ask ourselves what our language can teach us about how to best help our youth mature into responsible and capable citizens of our nation. You see one such citizen here. Today, I'm going to highlight what we have found so far in the linguistic record regarding the development of children from the perspective of Myaamia people living in the 1600s and 1700s. For example, in this developmental line, the entry here, te keešiniihkihankwiki, he or she is on a cradle board, refers to the practice of confining infants and younger toddlers on a cradle board during the workday especially. Today I'm also going to cross-reference these older cultural understandings and practices with the best that global science has to offer regarding biological, mental, and social development. Or to use more specific terminology, biosocial, cognitive, and psychosocial development. For example, on the other side of the line from te keešiniihkihankwiki, you can see that during the same period of time that children are confined to cradle boards, they begin to learn to crawl, to walk, and to speak. And they begin to develop an early sense of the self. Finally today, I'm going to ask us to think about how these developmental windows line up with three categories. Wrong button. Three categories: knowledge performance, significant life events, and learning tools. Knowledge performance, or what we ask our youth to do, is highlighted in the example that as our youth begin to speak their first words, some parents ask them to use Myaamia kinship terms to refer to their family members. Significant life events are the common life changes that have an impact on the majority of our youth. For example, in this case, the birth of a sibling. Learning tools are the things that we have created as a community that help youth and parents achieve the goals that we set for our youth and that they set for themselves. For example, the Nike iPhone and Android application that allows new parents to wrap their home in language so young children can hear their language daily. Taken as a whole package, this research, we hope, will help us to better understand the generations of knowledge that informed community perceptions of child development in the past. This reclaimed knowledge can help us to plan for the future of supporting our children in their development as Myaamia individuals and as members of Myaamia communities. So let's go back and take a look at the heart of this research, the developmental terminology that we find in the early linguistic record. This developmental line has Myaamia terminology on the left and global scientific research on development on the right. These two streams of knowledge cross at many points, and they're not in competition with each other. I've linked these two streams through the relative ages at which key changes or developments occur. The Myaamia developmental terms are color-coded along the following lines. Yellow denotes the earliest part of a young person's development. The terms used to refer to children during this period tended to be gender neutral. The red and blue terms differentiate the gendered terminology for referring to Myaamia youth beginning around their 7th year, although a lot more research needs to go into this beginning point. I want to be clear here at the start that these gendered categories were flexible. Within our communities, there have always been individuals who moved between these gendered categories. So let's take a closer look at this developmental line. I realized the type was way too small in the first slide. This first section is associated with pelusake, or babies. But this term pelusa, the noun that I had first learned as meaning baby, can actually be used to refer to one's entire childhood. From the time you are born until the time you are 25, you could be referred to as pelusa. So it means both baby and child, maybe in a broader sense. The first term here, for example, welahokota, means floating in a proper place. It's the prenatal period of development. And for example, some recent research coming out of Germany indicates that language learning may in fact begin in the 3rd trimester while a baby is in the womb. But this research indicates that all voices are not equal during the prenatal period. It's the mother's voice that has the greatest influence. And that mother's voice, mother's language, begins to set the patterns for that child's learning of their first language in their house. Research has not been done yet on what the baby experiences with multilingual parents, but I think that'll be interesting to find out as things move forward. Take Kanawita here, which I've already talked about, she or he is on the cradle board. Historically, the cradle board was a means by which children were protected and cared for during the first years of life. Right? Myaamia people didn't have pack and plays, and people needed to be out in the fields working, and many times you'll see older female children were also in the fields working, and so the babies were tipped against a tree in a cradle board. And this had a significant impact on their development as Myaamia people. Walaholinda here, to be swaddled, or again in his or her proper place, or swaddled. Peimata chimoche, crawling like a baby or a snake, and the other reference is crawling like a pumpkin vine, which I like that metaphor. Nulita here, he or she walks in an unsteady way. It was used to refer both to those of advanced age and those first learning to walk. And peimbaleche, she or he walks. You can see that there's a lot of terminology here clustered in the early years of life, between birth, or really beginning with the third trimester, and about 2 years of age. And you can see in global science, there's a whole host of mental developments going on after that window, of course. But what I'm trying to indicate here is our research isn't done. The records are incredibly rich and they're incredibly dense, and so that what we're hoping is that there'll be a lot more information to fill out these years, because 1 to 5 is really, really key, both from brain development for language learning, and also, I think, indicate from society a key window of time we have to work with our children before they leave the home for school. That's not good. The next set of terms in this developmental line, Achkwanezunza, little young girl, and Kwiwisenza, little young boy, approximately around 7 years old. That's, you can't read them clearly, the red terms, but that's these guys right here. The terms Achkwanezunza and Kwiwisenza potentially demonstrate that children began to follow gendered behavior norms before puberty. And by comparison, in American culture, the development of gendered play begins as young as 4 years old, sometimes even younger. In addition, the terms Achkwanezunza and Kwiwisenza do line up well with the beginning of a youth's ability to understand logical principles and apply them to real-life situations, what's called concrete operational thought. And so, looking at the way global science's research on the development of logic, and then when our own terms begin to be used to differentiate youth, we're noticing interesting connections between those things that perhaps indicate observed behavior over long periods of time, and that our language and our culture came to reflect those understandings. The development of logical thinking continues into the next Myaamia stage, and this is the stage that immediately precedes puberty. These two gendered terms are Kwiwisa, young boy, and Ahkwanizwa, young girl, both approximately 10 to 12 years old. That's these two right here. At first glance, it might seem that these terms line up with the actual beginning of puberty according to global science, but it's important for us to remember that historically puberty did not begin this early. Much of the current research on puberty indicates there has been a steady decline in the age of the onset of puberty over the last century. It remains unclear what cultural and physical developments then these Myaamia terms are focused on. It may have been, we don't know, but it may have been that this 2-year window was used to culturally and socially prepare youth for the transition to adulthood that begins with puberty. The Myaamia developmental terms most associated with puberty are Kwiondesa, a young grown man, and Ahkwesenza, a young grown woman, both approximately 12 to 16 years old. It's during this time period that both males and females develop primary sex characteristics, those directly associated with reproduction. For example, it is during this window of time that most young women have their first menstrual period. In Myaamia communities of the 1600s, there would have been a great degree of cultural importance in various cultural practices that marked this change. During this period, young women began to spend more time with adult women, completing the same tasks and carrying out many, but not all of the same responsibilities. And the same was also true of young men spending time with adult men. What's important here to note is that this is when physically it becomes possible to engage in reproduction, but most of these young people don't look like adults yet physically, and of course they're not behaving like adults yet. So the physical maturity and the mental maturity are still far behind adult maturity levels. Now we reach the developmental terminology that was giving me Chikolita fits. Kwiwa, unmarried young man, and Ahkwesa, unmarried young woman, from about 16 to 20 years old. It's over this period of time that males and females develop most of their secondary sex characteristics, and as a result, they begin to physically look like adults. In Myaamia communities of the 1600s, Kwiwa and Ahkwesa took on some of the responsibilities of adulthood. Ahkwesa worked in the agricultural fields with their mothers and aunts and helped care for their family's homes and children, their siblings, their non-biological children, and nieces and nephews. I'm going to use that term a couple of times, so those of you who know Myaamia kinship system know what I mean by non-biological children, but those of you that don't, my brother's children are also my children, and if I'm a woman, my sister's children are also my children. So it's possible to not be an adult in a Myaamia village, but actually have children, but they're not your biological children. However, as Me Chikolita pointed out, both Kwiwa and Ahkwesa were not deemed mentally mature enough to be considered ready for marriage and biological parenthood. Though Me Chikolita didn't mention this explicitly, originally Kwiwa and Ahkwesa did not take part in their respective village councils. Their relative lack of maturity meant that they were not ready to participate in the governance of their village. In the 1820s, when Kwiwa and Ahkwesa began to marry earlier, they also began to sit in on the village councils, disrupting the leadership practices of their community. And this is something that shows up throughout the historical record, especially, let's say, around the time of the War of 1812, that the young men were imposing themselves in councils and disrupting the governance of the village. This is an important social change that has negative consequences for Myaamia communities. The final two developmental terms in this line are Lenia, a marriageable man, and Matemsa, a marriageable woman, approximately 18 to 25 years old. In the most basic sense, these last developmental terms are not based on solar age, not the number of suns you've seen rise, not the number of winters you've seen, as we'd say it in our language. But instead, this term is based really on maturity. Someone became an adult when their community recognized they were ready to assume the responsibilities of adulthood. This did not mean one was obligated to get married in a Myaamia's community. There are many historical cases of individuals who did not marry and did not have biological children, and yet they assumed the many other responsibilities of adulthood, especially being leaders of their communities. Given the Myaamia kinship system, of course, many of these individuals still became usahe, fathers, and nakihe, mothers, because they're siblings. And almost everyone had siblings of one sort or another, had children oftentimes. What this suggests is that unlike legal adulthood in the United States, age was not a clear indicator of adulthood in Myaamia communities. Me Chikalita and Pinjiwa stated in 1824, again to Charles Trowbridge, that, quote, "There is no particular age at which young men cease to be considered children. It depends altogether on their disposition and their capacity." This cultural understanding of adulthood has many interesting parallels with what the current science is indicating about brain development in adulthood. Recent research has found that the brain continues to mature into one's 20s, and in some individuals even into their 30s. When May Chikalita complained that 16 and 17-year-olds in the 1820s were taking on the duties and responsibilities of adults, he was lamenting a change in cultural behavior that also had and continues to have biological components. The brains of 16 and 17-year-olds are not as fully developed as 25-year-olds. This is no insult to the 16 and 17-year-olds in the room. It's growing and it will get there. It is possible that the cultural practices that May Chikalita defended developed out of observations of the deficiencies of 16 to 20-year-olds in higher order cognitive capacities, which include long-term planning, the control of impulses, and judgment and decision-making. Recent research indicates that there may be a connection between the integration of brain functions, which occurs throughout one's 20s, and the development of these, quote, higher order cognitive capacities. So these are all the skills that are especially key for leaders in communities, right? So that the delay of gratification, long-term planning, the ability to control oneself in tense situations, and issues related with judgment. These are all the things that leaders need. And so if young people began to sit in on their village councils, especially during the disrupting times around the War of 1812, that influence was incredibly negative on what happened in our communities. Now let me be clear, I'm not trying to suggest that May Chikalita was some kind of early scientist or that he had a PET scanner hidden away in his wikiyame. What I'm trying to argue is that many of these cultural behaviors had a logic behind them, a logic that was generations old, and that some of this logic is supported by what global science is now showing us about brain development. So, why does all this matter? If we want to develop a plan to support our youth in their growth as Myaamia individuals and as members of Myaamia communities, then that plan should reflect our community's past as well as our present. By structuring our developmental line using our language, we empower ourselves to think about who we were, who we are, and who we want to be in a way that allows us to carefully differentiate our needs from the needs of American society. By combining our linguistic understandings and the best of our knowledge with the best of what global science tells us about youth development, we also avoid accidentally trapping ourselves in the amber of the past. So now, my presentation turns to you, Ewe Makeke, my Myaamia relatives. I ask you to think about the following. What do we want our youth to be able to do? What important life moments do we want to help our youth prepare for? And what tools do we need in order to accomplish these things? To help foster this discussion, let me return to the 3 additional lines that I introduced at the beginning of my presentation. In my opinion, one of the most important questions a community can ask itself about its future is what they want the next generation to be able to do, to accomplish. This is the performance of knowledge. Lots of cultures, and I think my own experience as a teacher and a student in American culture, Lots of cultures ask their young people to know things, right? But they're not explicit about what they want people to do with those things. And they oftentimes don't assess the doing, they just assess the knowing. Knowledge is abstract by itself. In our community, I've learned over time that wisdom is in fact about action. Those recognized as wise are those who use their deep knowledge in an appropriate manner. Simply knowing is not enough. It is the doing that is essential to wisdom. This knowledge performance line parallels some of the actions that we might expect of our youth with the actions that American culture expects of its youth and our youth. As with global science, I'm not positioning Myaamia knowledge performance in competition with American performances. Instead, this separation is a recognition of distinctiveness. For example, around the age of 16, American society asks its youth to begin taking a series of tests of their knowledge. And these tests oftentimes determine their course as they mature. The ACT, the SAT, AP exams, and the driving test. Of these tests, I think it's interesting to note only the driving test involves actually doing something. By comparison, a major historic rite of passage among Myaamia communities was fasting in order to have a dream of some consequence, what some people call a vision. I tend to avoid that word because of all the stereotypes. These dreams provided individuals with direction in life, and they were hard and difficult to earn. They required a lot of doing. At times, these dreams could lead to a change in community behavior, so they had to be recited before the community in various contexts. The dream was also a necessary step and a requirement in some cases on the path to adulthood. All along the winding course to adulthood, there are many twists and turns and whirlpools and waterfalls. Many of these changes in the flow of the developmental river are happenstance accidents that cannot be predicted. Additionally, some societies they manufacture rites of passage to mark biosocial, cognitive, and psychosocial developments. This significant life events line is an attempt to lay out some of the possible life events a young person might experience. In this section of the line, we're looking at approximately the first 5 years of life. For language learning purposes, we've long known about the importance of early exposure to language, in part because the language centers of the brain are developing very, very rapidly during this period. In addition, this line shows 2 life events that can be extremely influential in language development: daycare and school. Often, these are the first times a young child will leave their home to be under the direct care of people other than their parents or guardians. If these environments are supportive of the language taught in the home, they can have a positive impact. But if they are hostile to it, then the impacts can be dramatically negative. It is possible, if we as a community want it, to develop the means to help our families prepare their youth for these important transitional moments. And many of you may be thinking of things like immersion daycares, right, where children can actually go and experience the Myaamia language. And that's an idea that I think in the generations to come might bear fruit. But really I'm thinking more basically about helping parents have a conversation amongst themselves and figure out ways to talk to their young people about what they're going to experience when they leave the home, when they leave the language nest. And those kinds of things are going to be very important for people who choose to send their children outside the home for daycare and school. The final line we're going to look at today, it's the last time I'll have you look at small type, I promise, is the learning tools line. Throughout this presentation, I've spoken of many different ways we could reach the diverse into the lives of our youth and have a positive impact. In some cases, we're already doing this and have built the tools to help us do so. But in other cases, things exist only in the idea stage, and the means of accomplishing our goals don't yet exist. On this line, the tools we've already built are colored light blue, and the tools we'd like to create but haven't yet are colored yellow. In this section of the line, you can see that there have not been that many tools created yet for the 1 to 5-year-old. Many times in this presentation, I've talked about the importance of this developmental window for a variety of reasons, but language stands out to me as singularly important. This is why 2 of the 4 new projects we'll be engaging with over the next 5 years are focused on this window. The birth kit is still in the brainstorming stage, so it's a great point to begin to talk about this, about something that might go to homes when a new child is born to prepare families for language teaching, as well as these transitional moments, as well as train them in the use of the other various tools that will exist to use over the child's entire life. This project, if it, as it develops, will likely be a product of collaboration between the Myaamia Office of Education and the Myaamia Center. And the next phrase book, if you've seen the previous 2, they're back in the tables back there. You can take a look at the previous ones. They were centered on greetings and school. The next phrase book will be focused on infants and young children and the language that parents can use with their infants. Over the coming years, we will continue to add layers to our understanding of biosocial, cognitive, and psychosocial development from a Myaamia point of view. I hope that in the near future, we as a community can begin to come to some consensus on what we want our youth to be able to accomplish. In the same vein, I hope that we can come to consensus about the key life events into which we want our community to have an impact. As we overlap these plans, the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma, through the Cultural Resources Office, Myaamia Education Office, and the Myaamia Center, will build the tools that are a part of achieving these goals. In conclusion, well, I'd like to say, first of all, I'm shocked I haven't run over my time. The rare occasion I go first and I'm given permission to and I actually stick within it.
By no accident.
Yeah. As I look out over the audience, I see many Myaamia heritage students, current students and graduates. This is what we call our students who attended Miami University. When I think of our students, I'm reminded of how brilliant, how funny, and how patient they are. And I'm jealous of the community they have. It's something I didn't have as an 18 to 21-year-old. But when I think of our students, I also envision all of you as future parents. Some of you are current parents. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not encouraging you to run out and start having babies. As May Chicolita would have said, wait until you're about 25. But it seems to me that most of you will be parents in the future. Perhaps of your own biological children, perhaps of adopted children, and likely parents in the Myaamia sense of the word, what are called aunts and uncles in English. If we want to accomplish the bigger goals that I have laid out here today, if we want to even come to agreement about what those goals are, it will require your generation as parents of Myaamia children to link your arms together with all of our arms, together with your parents and your grandparents, and along with the educators of our community. And together we can blaze a new trail that uses the best of our ancestral knowledge and the best of global knowledge systems to raise successive generations of aancihtaakiaki, changemakers, dreamers, as our ancestors once did. Ayalko mizikawa Myaamiaki, ayalko mizikawa ewe malaka koke, missionewe tepe.